Greetings, residents of Co-op City. This is Bob Klehammer, your Executive General Manager. I want to take this opportunity to report to you on the current status of the Riverbay Corporation's budget and the reason why we have asked the board and the board approved an emergency increase to our carrying charges of 7.5%. Before we start with the presentation, let me give you a little background on how our budget is produced. By regulations of the State of New York's Department of Housing and Community Renewal, we're required to produce a budget every 2 years. That budget process takes several months and results in a draft budget being presented to the board, usually in February of the year that we produce it. And that is usually done in odd-numbered years. So our last budget was produced and approved by the board in April of 2021. That budget originally projected a surplus of approximately $5 million. However, within 3 months of that budget being passed, we started to notice dramatic increases in prices for many goods and services that we purchase to supply services to the community. A lot of that was due to increases that we started seeing in natural gas prices. And you'll hear a lot of my speech will focus on natural gas, as that is the primary fuel that we use at the power plant to provide you with heating, cooling, and electricity. But as I said, in 2021, we started to notice spikes in all prices across the board. We actually did a reforecast of the budget in November of 2021. A mere 6 months after we had originally finalized the initial budget. That turned our $5 million surplus into a $1.2 million deficit. We continued to do further projections and reforecasts for the board. In fact, we did 4 altogether, which resulted in the final amended budget that the board used to approve the 7.5% increase. During this presentation, you'll hear from me explain the components of our budget. I'll also show you a summary of the last 4 years of actual operating expenses. And then I want to give you a comparison of last year to what we project will be our expenses this year. And that will also include a recap of some of the historical data of the major causes for the 7.5% increase. And then finally, I want to talk to you about our capital budget, which is also a big user of the funds that we generate here. The first item that I want to talk to you about is what we describe as our discretionary and non-discretionary. And that's our major components of the budget. The non-discretionary expenses is also the largest single component of the budget. And those are expenses such as payroll and fringe benefits for the staff, the debt servicing of our mortgage, our utility costs, including natural gas, our water and sewer expenses that we pay to the city, our real estate taxes, and our insurance costs. We also have an expense that is called a reserve replacement. And those are funds we're required to deposit into a bank account by our debt service lender, Wells Fargo. And that's funds that actually is like us paying ourselves so that we have money in the bank to do future capital improvements. Now, let's review a summary of the last 4 years of operating expenses. The chart that you are looking at now gives you that summary. It goes back to to the budget year of 2018-2019. And you'll see between 2018 and 2021, increases in our expenses actually were quite reasonable. And actually in budget year 2020 and 2021, you'll actually see some decreases in expenses, which were attributable, I believe, to the pandemic. But in 2021 and 2022, you'll notice that we started to see some large increases, particularly in the categories of materials and services, which reflects the inflationary increases we began to see in most materials that we buy to use here in the community. Things such as the cost of replacement flooring, cost of lumber, the cost of plumbing supplies, things like that. You'll also see that we started to see an increase, a substantial increase, in our utility costs. You'll see that it went from $16 million in 2020 to $22 million in 2021. This is primarily due to the increase in natural gas prices. You'll also see that we have been having increases in our insurance costs. It jumped from $10.8 million in 2020 to $14.4 million in 2022. And this is a trend that we are seeing across the board for all of our insurances, whether it be property, auto, or general liability. The slide that you're seeing now is a chart of our actual operating expenses from last year. That's the fiscal year that ended March 31st of 2022, and the current fiscal year. This is the budget that we used to request from the board its approval of the 7.5% increase. As you will see, and as I pointed out on the previous chart, the expense increases that we are witnessing, particularly in utilities, water and sewer, and insurance, have continued into this year. So for instance, where last year I said we spent $22.2 million on utilities, we are projecting this year, based on the current cost of natural gas, to spend $36.2 million. That has increased the percentage of our budget that just pays for utilities, and primarily natural gas, from 9% of our budget last year to 14% of our budget this year. We also saw a $1 million increase in our water and sewer expenses. After we had produced the last budget, the city announced that it was going to increase water and sewer rates by 4.9%. Doesn't sound like a big number, does it? Except in Co-op City's case, because we are so large, that equated to a $1 million increase of our water and sewer expenses. And likewise, as I showed you increases in our insurance costs over the last few years, those increases are expected to also continue into this year. Last year we spent $14.4 million. This year we expect that could exceed $18 million. And that's really no fault of Co-op City. We have very few claims on our property insurance. We've had significant reduction in the number of slip and fall claims that apply to our general liability insurance. The problem is that large insurers have suffered significant losses from wildfires, hurricanes, tornado. The building that collapsed in Florida resulted in over $1 billion worth of payments being made by insurance companies. Now you might say, well, how does that affect us? Well, the issue when it comes to insurance is that we are all in a giant pool. The losses that are suffered by insurers in California or Florida or somewhere outside of New York are still forced onto us. Insurance companies are in the business to make money. If they suffer losses in one place, they've got to make them up in others. And that usually means a result is increased premiums that we pay for our insurance. The main drivers of this need for an emergency increase are utilities, water and sewer, and insurance costs. We've actually tried to mitigate some of those expenses by instituting a hiring freeze, which, as you will see, has decreased the percentage of our budget that goes to payroll and fringe benefits from 37% last year to 33%. We've also instituted some purchase restrictions on certain goods and services that will reduce our materials and service costs from 23% of our budget to 21% of our budget. But that still is not enough to offset the need for increased revenue. The chart that you're looking at now, I think, will give you a better idea of the cost of some of the services that we provide to the residents. This chart is a summary of the costs that we incur to maintain the power plant, the physical structure of the plant, the equipment in the plant, and the underground water, steam, and electrical conduits that provide you heating, cooling, and electricity. That is the first column on this chart. The second column, labeled energy, is the cost for the fuel we use. Natural gas, oil, and even there are times where we have to import power from Con Ed when we're servicing equipment in the plant. Natural gas, as I said, is our prime source of fuel to operate the plant. The third column is a combination of the cost of those two. The fourth column is the cost of water, so that the final column will give you the total cost, on average, of the amount of your monthly carrying charge that goes to providing for maintenance of the power plant, the purchase of the fuel we use for the power plant, and providing you with potable water. So if you live in our typical apartment, 5 rooms, which is typically a 2-bedroom apartment with a balcony, $381 of your monthly carrying charges goes directly to these expenses. That's probably about a fifth of the monthly carrying charge just goes to providing you with heat, hot water, cooling, and potable cold water. Now, I've spoken a lot about natural gas being a prime driver of this increase. This next chart will give you an idea of just over the last year, the increase in our costs of natural gas. This chart goes back to April of 21. All of these numbers are actual expenses, and this is primarily just for the cost of the gas, not the transportation cost to get it here. This is for the commodity. If you go back to April of 21 and compare it to April of 22, you will see that almost every month from April of 22 to September of 22, our comparable gas price over the previous year was anything from $500,000 to over $1 million additional cost. And we haven't even gotten into the highest cost season, which is the heating season from November to March. And that's the shaded area of 2021, 22. And as you'll see, even in the actual cost of last year, the minute we start to provide heat to the complex, the cost average goes up $1 million a month. So if we spent $1.6 million last December, we can expect a bill that's going to be over $2.5 million this year. Costs have been going up and down, but the general trend from our commodity advisors has been that this cost will go up once the weather starts to get much colder. And finally, as I stated earlier, you'll see the actuals of how our insurance costs have gone up since 2018, where we paid $7.8 million, and we're budgeting for this year, we expect those costs to be $18 million. That's a $10 million annual increase in our total insurance costs over a 4-year period. As I said previously, the last 4 years, we have pretty much been able to pay all of our operating expenses through the collections that we get from you as the shareholders, from our commercial tenants, from our garage fees, and other sundry revenue streams. But another component of our budget is for our capital improvement projects. And those you have seen going on throughout the community in the last 4 years. Things such as the elevator modernization project, the Local Law 11 facade work that has been done to the buildings, but we've done many lesser projects that you may not have noticed, and a complete list of those is being shown on the screen as I speak. These projects were necessary to improve the infrastructure of the community. When I was first retained to become your executive general manager in 2016, then board president Cleve Taylor gave me one mandate, and that was to get many stalled capital improvement projects going and to produce a capital budget which was reflective of the needs of the community to improve what I would label as deferred maintenance. For many years, I think conditions of Co-op City were allowed to deteriorate. And I think the prime motive was to avoid having to institute carrying charge increases. Well, the result with that was a very decrepit infrastructure. The chart you are seeing now will give you the amount of money that we have spent over the last 4 years on capital improvements. This is almost $100 million in improvements that we have made. And we probably have another $30 million ongoing and planned to start in the next year. To pay for these projects, we used funds that were in the bank. Primarily, these funds came from proceeds of your first mortgage refinancing you did in 2012. Very little work had been done with these funds. As I said, my mandate was to get stalled projects started again and start new ones needed for the improvement of the community. So you will see that in 2019, we had $65 million in the bank that was to be used for capital improvements. And we have slowly drawn these down. That resulted in us refinancing the mortgage once again this past April. As a result of that refinancing and taking care of what were then low interest rates, we were able to receive proceeds of approximately $124 million. Those were deposited into a blocked reserve fund, can only be used for capital improvements. They only are released to us with the approval of our lender, Wells Fargo, State HCR, and HUD. That's the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Renewal, which provides our mortgage with the insurance that we are needed to get Wells Fargo to lend the money. As I said, those funds can only be used for capital improvements. We cannot touch that money to offset any kind of operating deficits, the deficits that are the reason why we need this 7.5% carrying charge increase. So as I said, what you are now seeing is a list of both completed capital improvements since 2016 and some capital improvements that we are planning to start over the next 12 months. Some of those future improvements include upgrading the garage elevators, completing our installation of ADA compliant entrances to all of our tower buildings, starting some facade work on the townhouse clusters, and also improving the pump rooms in every building so that we can have better reliable delivery of potable water and hot water. In closing, this has been a difficult last few years. We were able to manage the complex through a pandemic. We were able to keep our staff safe. We were able to keep residents as safe as we possibly could. From the pandemic, we had the effects of supply chain shortages. There were times we couldn't even get certain materials. We then have suffered through inflation that I think was caused by those supply chain issues, but has been further exacerbated by a war in Ukraine that put pressure on fuel markets. All of this has resulted in where we are today. We have money in the bank, as I said, to pay for future capital improvements, but we need this increase to fund our operations. And as I said, we're not alone. Many housing companies are facing the same situation. These are the facts. I'm not sure anybody saw a pandemic that hadn't happened in 100 years coming, or the results of that pandemic. So as I said, these are the facts. We strive every day to try to do things better and cheaper for the residents while also maintaining a level of service to you. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to address you.